Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very happy to see all of you. Looking out, I know we have a very serious and extremely knowledgeable crowd on the issue of the AIDS pandemic and the challenges that it's brought to the world. I want to make just a few key points by way of introduction to Mead's very important book. The first is that, as you are all very well aware, there's been a huge surge in donor financing for HIV/AIDS treatment over the past decade. And that has saved millions of lives. There's certainly no question about that. It is an amazing achievement. And I think since we're here in Washington, it's worth saying that the United States has played a very important role in realizing that achievement, along with many other donors, and of course along with the budgets, the commitment of policymakers and leaders in the developing world. I know from Hillary Clinton's speech, that I'm sure many of you who follow this issue are well aware of, that it's a little bit of a new moment right now in the HIV/AIDS community. There is a sense that we might be at the beginning of the end of the pandemic. To me, it's a little bit like, maybe are we at the moment when what seemed like an impossible task actually attracted more resources and more genius when President Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon. So it's that kind of moment. So it's a great moment to have Mead's book appear. The fact is that the number of people living with AIDS, even as we think about the incredible achievements so many people's lives saved and made better, still the number of people living with AIDS, and therefore the number of people needing treatment, is growing faster than the funding that is needed to treat them. And that's essentially the dilemma that Mead deals with in this new book. I'd like to just say a couple of things about the new book that I like. Two things that I like. First, Mead calls attention to prevention. I think that may not seem new, but when Mead started this work, it was still new, even as the enthusiasm for treatment was gaining a lot of momentum because of the falling price of ARVs. He also calls attention to how little we know about how to do prevention in specific places, what works where. Second, he calls attention to the role of incentives for governments in the developing world to increase attention to prevention, while taking into account the demand for treatment. And he does that in a very thoughtful and careful way. And those of you who know my own work and my interest in cash on delivery aid and paying for performance will appreciate that I like the way Mead picked up on that idea and treats it in a very careful and thoughtful way, including the trade-offs, how to deal with the reality that there might be a trade-off between treatment and prevention, at least in the short run. I just wanted to say in this crowd that I am thinking back right now to the issues meeting we held on Mead's book. Well, it's probably over a year ago, if not a little bit more. And for those of you who knew Phil Musgrove, to say, Phil liked those two things about this book. The focus on prevention as something that needed much more attention, and the focus on incentives carefully designed and thoughtfully applied to make something better happen for more people in the world. Now let me say a word about Mead. Many of you will know him from his now several decades of work on HIV/AIDS. Mead is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. He came from the World Bank, where he worked on this issue for many years. I sort of like it when Mead tells the story, where are you, Mead? That I got him to come. right? A long time ago, to the World Bank, at a time when the World Bank wasn't really that, as an institution, wasn't quite ready to cope with the reality that the AIDS problem might be a big one and create big demands in terms of money. But Mead came and he really drove, along with several others, of course, at the World Bank, a lot of the changes that we saw there over the last now 2 decades almost. Mead taught at Williams College and at Boston University. He was in the Peace Corps in Burkina Faso a long time ago. And the thing about Mead's teaching in those 2 places is that he tells me, I don't know, it seems as though every other day, oh, this person or that person who's doing good work in the field was a student of mine. So he leaves a legacy not only in his books and his own work, but in the training and the passion that he conveyed to many students. Mead, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Thank you all for coming today to the launch of this book, which proposes a new perspective for the international struggle against the AIDS epidemic. I want to particularly thank the 4 panelists who've made space in their busy schedules to come. David Wilson from the World Bank. Where's David? There he is in the corner. Ambassador Jimmy Kolker, who has worked on AIDS at Pepfar before moving on to UNICEF, where he headed the AIDS division. Laura Garrett, who's a celebrated author, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and Professor Ken Leonard, who has not worked specifically on AIDS, but works a lot on incentive issues in developing country settings. And we're going to have a chance to hear them discuss the ideas in this book and anything else they have on their mind after I finish in just a couple of minutes. Most of you know that, so to introduce that discussion that you'll hear in a few minutes, I'm going to try to be very short. I'm going to say a little bit about why I think that this new perspective is necessary. Nancy's already said a few things about that. I'm going to say what the AIDS transition is as I conceive of it, and I'm going to say how I think we can accelerate the move to the AIDS transition. Now, most of you know that this year the AIDS epidemic is officially 30 years old, and you know it's still growing, with 33 million people infected with HIV, 16 million people needing treatment by WHO's current definition of need, of whom only 5 or 6 million people are receiving that treatment in the developing world. So this is a big problem, and we also know that funding is not unlimited. So Nancy referred to the extraordinary increase in funding that occurred between 1997, the establishment of UNAIDS, and the year 2008. The rate of growth was actually 28% a year, and for over a decade. I'm not aware of any other type of foreign assistance or even category of expenditure that has grown for 28% a year for a decade. Think how fast that is. 28% a year, that means doubling every 2.5 years. The epidemic is 30 years old now, and we can project that it's going to continue decades into the future. In 25 years, a rate of growth of 28% a year would take $13 billion to equal 15 trillion. That's the size of the US debt. So 28% a year really, really was not sustainable. And sure enough, as we know, when the 2008 financial crisis hit, and even before, in the Pepfar reauthorization bill of 2008, President Bush programmed a change of course for that rate of growth. He already programmed in a flattening of the program of the U.S. government's expenditure. This graph shows what happened to U.S. government expenditure from 2008 on to 2011, the way it flattened out. The top line is total spending, which is still under $6 billion, and the red line is an approximation of what portion of that is being spent on AIDS treatment. So with only a third of the people who need treatment receiving it, even after all these years of really exceptional effort, we have to recognize that we're going to need to have a new perspective if we're going to try to attempt to meet this epidemic and continue to make progress, not give up, but at the same time do so within what is certain to be a less explosively growing budget, possibly a flat budget. So the idea of the AIDS transition is depicted in this diagram. What we're calling for here is something that really is basically very simple. The red line represents the number of AIDS deaths per year, and the green line the number of new infections per year. And what we're calling for in the AIDS transition is explicit planning by donors and by recipient governments for the new infections per year to be pushed down below mortality. So we want to hold mortality down while pushing new infections even lower. Where does this idea come from? Well, in my case, I was inspired by my knowledge of an historical phenomenon that is called the demographic transition. The demographic transition is a classic story from development of Europe, and then more recently of many developing countries. Here you can see the birth rate of a typical European country in pre-modern times in stage 1 on the left of the graph. The birth rate is in blue. It fluctuates from year to year, but it was quite high at 40 per thousand per year. The death rate also was equally high, and that's in red. So when both were high, the population did not grow. It was quite stable at a small level. But then with urbanization and industrialization, as public health methods began to spread in the society, we saw death rates fall dramatically, as you see the red line dropping down. And as death rates fell but birth rates remained high, the population started to grow rapidly. And the population grew until stage 3, which you see here is labeled as mature industrial. And in stage 3, the birth rate then began to fall, until in stage 4, in some countries, it's actually now below the death rate, and the populations are shrinking. The black line shows on the right axis the total number of people. You can see that it's flat when both rates were high. It's growing rapidly when the rate of birth was much higher than the rate of death, and then it flattens out again. So the transition refers to a change from a situation where both rates are very high to a situation where both rates are very low. And what I'm suggesting here is an analogy with the AIDS situation today. Deaths from AIDS in all regions of the world have been falling, and they've been falling thanks to the very rapid and successful expansion of access to antiretroviral treatment. The lower line in each of these graphs that comes from UNAIDS represents what actual deaths have been in each of these 4 regions, while the upper line represents what deaths would have been in the absence of treatment. And you can see that that divergence began early in Latin America because the Latin American countries were middle income and they had the resources to begin to pay for AIDS treatment even when it was very expensive. The divergence happened much later in sub-Saharan Africa, and in fact coincided with the really dramatic expansion in 2003 of US support for AIDS treatment and the Pepfar program. But while the deaths have been dropping rather rapidly, the new infections, which is analogous to the births in the demographic transition, the number of new infections has been declining much more moderately. You see a slightly different pattern in each of the 4 regions here, with peaks in the epidemic in Asia, for example, in 1996, a less marked peak in Africa in 1997, a very pronounced peak in Eastern Europe and Central Asia in 2002. The annual number of infections peaked in all of these regions in those years. In Latin America, it's less clear that there was a peak. You even seem to see relatively stable situation there. But the most important of these regions in terms of numbers of infections is clearly sub-Saharan Africa, where there has been a constant rate of decline of about 2% per year since 1997. If we look only at the 18 countries where the US government has been most active, the countries where Pepfar has very rapidly expanded treatment, what we see is that death rates have fallen since 2005 at an annual rate of 5.6% a year. And that's in comparison to new infections, which have also fallen, but at the much smaller rate of 1.8% per year. So that the pattern is very similar to the one we see at the beginning of this transition. AIDS deaths are falling now because of the access to treatment. New infections have not yet fallen as fast as they need to in order to get us to the AIDS transition. The AIDS transition, that is the point where new infections fall below deaths, is the point when we really begin to turn around this epidemic in the sense that the burden of people living with HIV/AIDS who need annual support for their treatment begins to finally fall. And we know that Secretary Clinton and UNAIDS have expressed a eloquent vision of a world without AIDS. I want to submit to you that unless we can get to this point where the total number of people living with HIV/AIDS begins to fall, we won't get to a world without AIDS. This is a necessary stepping stone, a milestone, if you will, on the road to that world without AIDS. So some people have responded to this idea by asking me, why are you comparing new infections to mortality? Why not compare it to a much more optimistic sounding thing, which is the enrollment of people on treatment? Well, there are three reasons why I think, although that's an important comparison, it's not the most basic one. First of all, making that comparison in a simple way would ignore the fact that low quality treatment, in fact, does not sustain the reduction in mortality. Our objective is to keep mortality down, and that requires enrollment in high quality treatment. Enrollment in high quality treatment will achieve one of the two goals of the AIDS transition, which is to keep mortality down. But it also expands the fiscal and the dependency burdens. And therefore, I'm arguing that we need to define the AIDS transition as the point where new infections is pushed down below the rate of AIDS deaths. This objective will unite into one objective, the twin goals of suppressing AIDS mortality and reducing the overall burden. So I've talked a little bit about what the AIDS transition is. Now, in a way, it's just arithmetic. I think what's useful about the AIDS transition is that it does form an intermediate goal, but I'm going to argue that there are two things here that we can do to accelerate the AIDS transition, and both have to do with aligning incentives properly between the donor and the recipient and within the recipient country. So the first thing I want to describe is a suggestion for reframing the partnership between the donor and recipient. And for our representative from South Africa, I want to suggest that this discussion could also apply to the relationship between a federal government and a provincial government. So that's the first part of the how. The second part of the how has to do with applying this approach to foreign assistance that Nancy has talked about in her opening remarks, the cash on delivery approach, in which we pay a symbolic amount for every averted HIV infection. So first, let's think about the relationship between the donor and the recipient as it now stands. As it now stands, of course, and this is true not only for HIV, but it's true in every domain of the U.S. bilateral assistance programs and of the bilateral assistance programs of every country. The donor is free to move resources among recipient countries from one year to the next. It can shut down programs, it can start up programs, and we know that it frequently does so, and that recipient governments are frequently suffering from really total uncertainty about what they will receive from donors in the next year or two. Because of the fact that the donor is free to manipulate resources in that way, the recipient government is unsure if its contributions to that same objective, in our case AIDS treatment, will be in fact offset by reductions from the donor. So who gets the benefit when there are efficiency improvements, when there are reductions in the price at which antiretrovirals are purchased in country, when there are reductions in the improvements in the efficiency with which services are delivered, reductions in cost. Well, clearly the recipient government and the citizens get the health benefits, but the fiscal benefits go entirely to the donor in this scenario. So what we're arguing here is that instead of this status quo relationship, there should instead be a multi-year commitment between the donor and the recipient government. This is something that's difficult for the US to do because of constitutional constraints, but we know from Hillary Clinton's speech that the US is already making multi-year commitments to the Global Fund. Those have to be informal commitments between the administration, in which it must be promising to attempt to ask Congress for that money. Nevertheless, if the U.S. can make such a multi-year commitment to the Global Fund, it could also make one to Nigeria or Burkina Faso or Mozambique. And what we're suggesting is the donor make a multi-year commitment until the date of the AIDS transition, as it's projected to be by the best models, and that the commitment be for the percentage of treatment need that the donor feels it's willing to provide. Now, if that percentage were always 100%, I would not be here. We would be living in a world where resources were not scarce. But I want to suggest to you that it's unlikely to exceed 70% in any country, and in many countries it will be more like 30%. But whatever the donor is willing to finance in terms of the total treatment need, whatever percentage, it should agree to up front for the period required. It might be 5 years until the projected date of the AIDS transition, or it might be 10, or it might be 15. But that means committing to that stream of resources for treatment throughout that entire period until the AIDS transition is projected to arrive. Once that the donor has made a credible commitment of that sort, the recipient's in a much different position. It knows that its contributions will not be offset by donor subtractions, that every contribution it makes will in fact contribute to the health of its own citizens. And it also knows, suppose it decides to add to the 30% that comes from Pepfar an additional 5%. It knows that 5 out of the 35, what's that, 1/7 of all the efficiency gains in that program will accrue to the recipient government. So it gets its share of the efficiency gains, the financial efficiency gains as well. So this is the thing I think that the transition idea offers. It offers this possibility for what I would describe as an incentive-compatible contract where the donor country, or in the case of South Africa, the provincial government, would in fact have the fiscal as well as the health-related incentives to improve the efficiency of its own program. But then once this is in place, there can also be an understanding that everyone hopes to be happily surprised. Everyone hopes that the rate of new infections will fall even faster than in this projection that we've used to compute the date of the AIDS transition. And if they do, that means the donor is going to save a lot of money. It won't save that money immediately, but if we project forward a faster decline in new infections, it means that in the year 2030, 2040, in the out years of this projection, there will be fewer people to treat. And that 30% that was committed will be 30% of a smaller number. So this means that the donor can be in a situation, even right at the beginning, to offer to the country that faster decline in new infections than has been projected can be rewarded by increasing the generosity of the donor's commitment to treatment. Take it from 30% up to 35 or 40%, depending on the magnitude of the prevention improvement. So this is, I think, a proposal for a way that the donor could relate to the recipient governments, which would improve the incentives for prevention and also integrate prevention and treatment. Now, I want to be absolutely clear that I'm not prejudging how the prevention should be done. One way that new infections can be reduced much more effectively is by appropriately targeting treatment so that it has the best prevention effect. We know from HPTN 052 that in a serodiscordant couple if the HIV positive partner is treated and treated effectively, that the chance of transmission to his uninfected partner is reduced by 96%. So I'm arguing that that can be very definitely one of the means by which the government might do much better on reducing the rate of new infections than the model would initially project them to be able to do. But there are many other ways that the government and that the citizens of the country might improve upon prevention. So that's where I come to cash on delivery. Cash on delivery is not a technical idea. It's an idea about changing the incentives. We know that the great success stories in HIV, whether we look at early years in Uganda or Thailand or in other countries where there have been partial or really fairly substantial successes in HIV prevention, I can't think of a case where national leadership and political leadership, a political willingness to address HIV prevention as a problem that the entire society must confront together, I can't think of a place where that has not been present. So what we want to do with this COD approach is to essentially leverage that type of leadership within the countries suffering the most from HIV. So these 5 key features of COD apply to it in every application, whether it be to education or to health or to road building for that matter. In the case of I'll speak specifically about HIV. The first and most important point is that this is a very extreme form of results-based financing. We want to reward only improvements, and in this case it would be HIV infections averted. Hands off, meaning that at least as part of this COD agreement, the donor does not ask how it's done, does not give advice about how it should be done. The responsibility for figuring out how to do it is entirely that of the recipient. The verification must be independent because it has to be the case that these infections are truly averted and that it's not just statistical legerdemain. Transparency is important not just because of the verification point, but we believe that in a country where the success or failure of local HIV prevention programs was transparently disclosed to the public on a regular basis, as we would require as part of this program, we believe that in such a country, governance will improve, the support for HIV prevention will improve, and that it will generally be a positive thing, not only for the HIV prevention effort, but for the country as a whole, and the sense of accountability within the health sector. And lastly, we're not suggesting that this cash on delivery reward replace input financing as it currently occurs. We don't believe that that is possible immediately. Maybe it could be possible in a very long run. But what we're suggesting is that the reward per HIV infection averted be a relatively token sum, that would perhaps exceed in total a maximum of not more than 5% of total HIV prevention funding from donors in that country. It's important to think about in the context of any results-based financing scheme, we want to avoid unintended consequences. And there are 2 classes of unintended consequences to which we would have to attend closely, and we would have to build attention to these possibilities into the original contract at the time that it's signed between the donor and the recipient. The first is we have to be sure through the independent verification mechanism that the measurement of HIV infections averted is not biased. And we do that not only by having a third party do the measurement, but by having a fourth party audit that measurement. And then it's also really essential, especially in the case of HIV, where stigma has been a problem, that we assure that the mechanisms that are used, that are developed independently by the people in order to try to achieve this cash on delivery reward, that those mechanisms meet the criteria for ethical conduct. That we want to assure through the frequent administration and implementation of social audits, such as the World Bank does in other cases, that human rights are not infringed in this process. So if it works, cash on delivery for HIV will elicit the local use of the best HIV prevention ideas. This is an important reason why I think it's a necessary ingredient in HIV prevention. There are ideas about HIV prevention which simply are not national or international. They are local ideas. They have to do with the local authorities, local traditional authorities, and changing of social norms within very local societies. What we're hoping is that by having this cash-on delivery approach at the top for the government, that the government will invent ways to cascade that set of rewards down to the local level where innovation is really necessary if we're going to see a big change in HIV infections. So if that works, then we'll see rapid reductions of HIV incidence. We'll get more quickly to the AIDS transition, which will put universal access within reach, and we'll do all of that without unintended consequences. So these are the two main themes in the book, and I very much look forward to the discussion from our four panelists of these ideas, and as I said, any others they have on their mind.
Let's bring the panel. While you're sitting down, although Mead gave very nice introductions, I'll elaborate just a little bit, starting with Lori, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I like this in her bio. She's the only writer ever to have been awarded all three of the big P's of journalism, the Peabody, the Polk, and the Pulitzer. So that's great. And Lori is actually a biologist. I think it's fortunate that she stumbled from biology into journalism, particularly on global health issues. Ambassador Jimmy Coker is here now. It's hard to keep track of what he's representing, but he's now at the Department of Health and Human Services. He has been at Pepfar. He has been at UNICEF. He was an ambassador to Uganda and Burkina Faso. He's a political scientist, so I hope he'll say something about the political economy of Mead's proposals. Ken Leonard is an economist at the University of Maryland, and he works especially on delivery issues. That's very important, very central now in development economics. I think of it sometimes as implementation science. It's time to move on from what should be done in a policy sense to how to get it done in terms of implementation. He has worked extensively in Africa, especially including Cameroon, Ethiopia, Gabon, Kenya, and Tanzania. And finally, David Wilson is here, and I'm thankful to him. I think he just got off an airplane. Not sure, but I know he's recently arrived from somewhere. David is the director of the Global HIV/AIDS Program at the World Bank. He's the one who corralled me into moderating that debate the other day, in which I learned a tremendous amount. David has been at the World Bank for how many years? Some years, guiding its work in HIV/AIDS. He taught at the University of Zimbabwe. He's from Zimbabwe for 20 years, where he served as professor and departmental head. So what we're going to do is give each person 3 minutes. I'm going to try to be tough, to say something to get us started, perhaps in reaction to the book itself and or to Mead's specific presentation. And then I'll try to have some questions and interchange with them and amongst them. And then we'll turn to all of you for your questions and comments. So shall we just go down the lines, ladies first, starting with Lori?
Thank you, Nancy. And in my very brief moments here, let me just go through a few key things. First of all, I think there was a time in the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic when there were really only two economists on the playing field doing anything that really mattered, and Mead was one of those two. And I don't know how we would have made it through the early days of dark days of this pandemic without Mead's input. Truly extraordinary. And anybody that finds this book controversial, and I think you'd be nuts not to, I challenge you to go to page 25 and look at that chart and tell me what the other answers are. and frankly, to go through the first roughly 70 pages of the hard data that Mead's crunched on what it would cost, to reach 80% uptake. He's looking at almost $500 billion. If you can figure out a way to do it cheaper, please do let us know. But I want to go through a few key points. First of all, I think donor support is going exactly the wrong way, and most of the data, if you can get your hands on it, for the last 12 months is extremely grim. We're now getting reports of collapsing HIV prevention and treatment programs in Portugal, in Greece. We're getting a very widespread information regarding particularly programs for IDUs in Western Europe, really getting undermined very rapidly. And you will have to see where we stand in about 6 months, but it so far is looking to me anyway like real disbursement versus commitment is way out of alignment, much worse than we've seen in the past. And there's not really a large appetite for putting HIV/AIDS front and center on the global agenda on the part of the likely donors. Second big point and concern on my part is that what this has resulted in so far is not so much a net decrease that we can really wrap our hands around in the total lump sum out there for what we could call global HIV programs, but a very severe skewing in the donor scene, so that the entire world is really dependent on two major donors. 68% of all private funds come from one human being, Bill Gates. Thank you very much. No board, no appeals process, no transparency. That's that donor. Then 52% of all global health funds from public donor comes from the United States government. 58% of all HIV publicly donated funds come from the United States government. So thank you very much, Ileana Ross-Layton, Kay Granger, etc. Let's just hope somehow miracles occur on Capitol Hill, and we're counting on Jimmy, and we'll see where that all goes. But clearly we are looking for creative financing, and we are looking for a better match between donors' input and outcomes, measurable outcomes. And this whole search for measurable outcomes is where the Global Fund is now in very deep trouble. And unless they can demonstrate within the next 12 months that they really do have measurable outcomes and accountability on all their funding, I think we're going to see a real further walk away from the major donors. Even if the United States hangs in there, I'm not sure the rest of the Europeans will. Okay, now, as for specifically what Mead is recommending, I first of all have never believed a single data point that is described as averted infections. I don't think we have any way of measuring that I trust. It's sort of asking UNAIDS to measure averted infections is like asking the American Cancer Society to measure impact of public health programs on decline in cancer. They have a vested interest in demonstrating that they've been highly effective. Incidence, to me, is the only reliable measure we can possibly hope to have to measure, to tell us whether or not prevention efforts are successful. The problem is that last year I headed up the scientific panel for the UNAIDS high-level declaration and commission on HIV prevention. And as part of that, we brought in all the leading incidence scientists, both on the epi side and the actual biology side of the problem. And it was universal. There was absolutely no deviation whatsoever from the group that we're not up to speed. We have never really funded this research. It's never been a priority in the United States or anywhere else. It's a trivial part of all NIH funding for HIV every year, if there even is a funding line for it. We don't even really have a reliable measure of it for the United States of America. And in fact, we've never made the AIDS transition in the United States of America. So I'm not really sure that we can have a whole program that's predicated on the assumption that we know whether or not a country can reliably say that their intervention was successful year to year. Unless we start seriously investing. And by the way, all the incidence measures we have are for the B clade. There have been some attempts to create valid incidence measuring capacity for C and D clade, but they are not in widespread use. The only ways I've seen them applied have been to specifically measure a targeted intervention, such as a vaccine trial. Even then, these are always the weakest parts of those database analyses.
This is great, and I hate
that's
to
fine.
stop you. Oh, good. Okay. I don't want you to set the precedent for going too long beyond, but it was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And over the past decade, Mead has been a great person to have a dialogue with, and I guess I'm here as a practitioner and program manager from the discussions we've had in Uganda when I was with OGAC and at UNICEF. And if you look at Roman numeral page 12 of the introduction, he acknowledges my critical perspectives and admits that he was not persuaded. So some of those perspectives are still true, but I wanted to start by giving a couple of positive notes that you didn't cover in your speech, but I think are values of the book. One is you woke me up to the idea of hotspots, that in all but about a dozen countries in the world, generalized efforts at prevention, probably, as UNAIDS said about their prevention efforts in Asia over the first 5 years of this decade, that 85% of the money went to prevent 5% of the infections because it was a very concentrated epidemic. So attention to hotspots, which you've repeated in this book, I think is a valuable underlining of the key populations. Performance-based incentives, which are in addition to COD but different from COD, I think could work, and I'll give a couple examples. In the appendix, you do an attempt at a costing analysis. It makes a couple wrong assumptions that the price of drugs will be steady for the next 30 years and that we'll still treat only people who have CD4 counts of 200 or less. But nonetheless, we need that kind of costing analysis. And so trying to perfect a tool which we can agree on is very important, and you've made an effort here. And we also need milestones to measure progress, and clearly prevalence is a very good one. But I guess my first hesitation about this book and the AIDS transition is that there's an implication that increasing deaths would be an acceptable way to achieve the milestone, which is macabre and it's immoral. And you talk about lower deaths, but your AIDS transitions are taking place in 2020, 2030, 2040, when the incidence based on current prevention models work. And clearly we needed a game changer. And I think the good news is that apparently after this book went to press, the publication of the study 052 is the game changer about treatment as prevention. And the book regretfully misses what I think is the current and will be the next year or two's debate about prevention and treatment, and especially how we use our investments in saying that treatment, the budgets for treatment and budgets for reducing incidence aren't separate. Lowering incidence is shouldn't be a prerequisite for figuring out how many treatment slots you have, but that clearly the benefits of proven biomedical prevention, especially antiretroviral treatment, but also PMTCT, male circumcision, pre-exposure prophylactics, microbicides, how much money should be spent on those compared to behavioral, which have been a large percentage of investment so far, but for which the evidence-based and the cost-effectiveness calculations are much weaker. And Pepfar has done some modeling, and I take Laurie's point to heart that it's difficult to model infections averted, but at the same time, they have found there's absolutely no way to get to the prevention numbers that we want, the lower incidence, without a much stronger emphasis on treatment as prevention. And so the idea that the people who are on treatment aren't transmitting every new sexually acquired infection is in a discordant couple. And if we can lower the viral load of those who are positive, the chances of changing the game and dramatically reducing the numbers of new infections, I think is much more promising. And there are models that show that this is not just, in even the medium term can be cost effective in terms of orphans avoided, infections averted, and the question of productivity of the people who are back in health. Talk very quickly about performance incentives. It seems to me that the performance-based incentives for things like partner testing for PMTCT outcomes, maternal mortality outcomes, such as having housing for women or paying women to deliver in facilities, there are some good examples of this at a micro scale, and those can be scaled up, and I think that Pepfar and I hope the Global Fund are interested in that kind of innovation. On the other hand, COD, in trying to imagine how as a practitioner, how running a program in Uganda, this would work, I didn't find the answer in the book. First of all, you're talking about less than 5% of the AIDS money the South Africa program is now $500 million a year, and the COD you're talking about is $2 to $3 million a year. In order to do the COD, you'd need a household survey prevalence study as a baseline. That costs more than $3 million a year. You'd need repeated household surveys and sero surveys to gauge the results. You'd have the evaluator, you'd have the auditor of the evaluator. And I think that the governments of Botswana and Rwanda could probably make this work so that the few $1 million incentive would actually, they could provide the data and give the leadership. But the unmet need is, just for PMTCT, a third of it's in Nigeria. The next largest countries in order are Democratic Republic of Congo, India, Mozambique, and Uganda. And it's inconceivable of me to think that those governments could be well enough organized with accurate data to be able to give the kind of performance measurement for the COD of $2 to $3 million, which frankly is what goes into graft, I fear, in some of those countries. And that, the 2 and 3 million going to the central government may or may not trigger the kinds of innovations and best practices and national ownership that you were talking about. It's not a cash prize that's going to solve our problems in those big countries. Finally, the time frame. I mean, Secretary Clinton did talk about an AIDS-free generation and talked about 2015. And your COD pilots were talking about a several-year pilot just to get the concept established for AIDS. And again, I think the time is now, and there's so many programs that are real-time, that's one that, if it needs to be considered, needs to be rethought of how can we get that to be an incentive for 2012 and 2013, not for 2020. If I have a couple minutes, I'll just mention a couple of questionable assumptions. I think there's a confusion in the book between U.S. leadership and the money, which as Americans, I think we should be very proud that we're providing for the global AIDS response, and for the U.S. having sole responsibility for outcomes. You talk frequently about Pepfar countries. Well, there are 57 Pepfar countries, I think, and the focus country idea is long gone. And the countries with the highest prevalence, South Africa, Swaziland, Namibia, Botswana, are in fact providing almost all of the treatment out of their own national funds. So the U.S. responsibility for treatment in those countries is much different than it is in places where that's not the case. And I think we really have to have a much more nuanced perspective of what the U.S. role is in meeting an AIDS transition. You talk still about high resistance rates. Happily, the experience to date is that the resistance rate has been at the low end of the spectrum. I think we have to worry about worst case scenarios, but I don't think we should assume worst case scenarios in the model. You invented the term disinhibition, and you talk about the evidence for that, which is not entirely on one side, but it has not been a major factor in terms of treatment scale-up, but you pose it as almost counterbalancing the advantages of treatment scale-up in some contexts. Talk also about a new entitlement, citing on pages 80 to 83, and the only citation for the creation of this new entitlement is your own work. And then you talk on page 94 about governments creating this new entitlement, but then reneging.
Okay,
and I'm not sure governments have done it.
You're getting too tough.
Okay. Good.
Well, you can save some of it for the next round.
Great.
I didn't want to stop you when you were defending the U.S. government.
Okay.
I gave you an extra minute on that, but you've wandered into more specific.
Great. I thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I didn't mean to be mean.
Okay, Kenneth.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say that Mead is an old friend of mine, and so I might be a little bit more sympathetic to his case. Although I would say that I would have willingly said before I read this book that Mead had never shied away from controversy. Now I think perhaps he seeks it. So this is a very controversial book, and I think there's a lot in this book for everybody to dislike. And it reminds me of a quote by Churchill, so that's putting you in good company there, Mead, that democracy is the worst form of government, except all others that have ever been tried. So I think the thing for the book is the best way you can read it and the best way you can comprehend it is to try and imagine what else you would suggest. And what we have right now is clearly not sustainable, and I think the evidence in the book is quite clear about that. So what else do you have in mind? And I think that's really what's exciting about the book. The second quick point that sort of comes to mind is essentially what Ambassador Kolkel just said, and this is a bit paraphrasing what he said, which is, I can't imagine how to do this in a particular country. I think it was Uganda that you mentioned. And that's precisely, I think, the point. No one in this room has any sense of how we can solve this problem at a particular location, at a particular time. And that's exactly what cash on delivery is admitting. We don't know the answer. Maybe there's someone else out there who does. How do we get the money in the hands of the person who might have an idea how to solve this problem? And I think that that's where we have to focus on that. So my own particular, the reason I'm sitting on this panel is because I don't have any answers to any questions in Africa. I simply study how is it that other people find answers to questions. And the closer you get to the ground, the more likely you are to find someone who has an innovative answer in particular settings. So cash on delivery has the advantage, and I don't want to use the word incentives. I think that's a pretty bad term, but I'm going to use the other term that Mead used earlier, which is aligning the goals between the donor and the recipient. Instead of funding whatever thing we can come up with based on some budget that we have available to us and thinking of, instead of some sort of irrational funding that hasn't really been thought through, we think, and then combining that with command and control where we try and force people to do what we think they should do, what we want to do is sit down and basically write out what are our goals, what is it that we're seeking to achieve, and how do we align, how do we get the people who we're handing the money to have the same similar types of goals. An additional benefit of cash on delivery is that once we specify the minimum set of goals necessary to implement a cash on delivery relationship, we are in essence allowing for innovation in the achievement of the specific goals. And I think innovation is really where, as I pointed out, innovation is really the important thing here. In this particular case, that is the AIDS transition, both the alignment of goals and the creation of innovation are desirable. So first, we all know it's cheaper to prevent than it is to treat. And as of currently, cure is not available. But secondly, and more importantly, the innovation by local actors is more important in prevention than it is in treatment. And innovations in treatment, innovations in prevention are more likely to come from local than they are from international actors. This is because the sciences, the behavioral sciences, the sociology, the psychology, the kinds of things that are necessary to figure out how do we prevent AIDS are the types of things that generally don't have global externalities. When you find the solution for a particular location in Uganda, you haven't found the solution for the rest of the world. You've still found the solution for that particular location. Whereas medicine in general, if you think about treatment for AIDS, this is something which has global externalities. So if you find an answer in one place, you're very likely to contribute to finding the answer everywhere else. So if you're going to have local people focusing on something, you want them focusing on prevention. And let the rest of us worry. Let the rest of the world, let Washington, D.C. worry about treatment. And also, if you want to have someone thinking about prevention, it's better that the local people are thinking about prevention than it is that we, for example, in Washington, D.C. are thinking about how to achieve prevention, because local actors are going to be the people who are more likely to be able to implement this thing. So what we have is a situation where cash on delivery passes the broad goals of the funders. They have to be specified. That's the reason why I say that this is like the quote about democracy. Writing down exactly what it is that we want to achieve and what are the ethical boundaries, carefully defining the ethical boundaries that are going to stay the same for the next 20 years is something that's a task we would all rather not have to do. We wouldn't want to have to specify what those things are, but the reality is we have those beliefs and we need to write them down. Once we've done that, then we release we release this engine of innovation in the local area where within the boundaries that we've specified, they look for the best, the most creative solution to the particular problem of preventing HIV/AIDS. The reason I think that most people have a hard time with this, and the reason that this is going to be a very controversial thing, is that we are all reluctant to give that up. Once we've written down, the 40 pages in which we've written down the ethical restrictions for what we expect people to do, we know in our mind that there's another 40 pages we just couldn't figure out how to write down, and so we're really reluctant to hand anything over to anyone else and say, okay, now you go out and find a solution. What we would rather say is, you tell me what your idea is, and then I'll tell you why it's wrong, and then I'll fix it, and I'll hand it back to you, and then I'll ask you to implement it, right? This is not cash on delivery, right? This is precisely how cash on delivery doesn't work, and the great thing, again, coming back to my original quote, is what we're currently doing, which is we ask people for suggestions, we fix them, we hand them back to them, and we try and force them to implement them. That has failed. So it's time to think of something else, and I think the great the contribution of this book is not in the specifics, because Mead would be the first person to say he doesn't know the answers in each of these locations, but in the creation of the framework where we try and pass down the incentive for innovation, using the word incentives unfortunately, down to the local area. So thank you, Mead, for this idea.
I just want to say that you filled me with happiness. Those of you who know the history of cash on delivery aid will understand what I'm saying. It's kind of my pet project. And I'm going to take the liberty of interrupting to say two things about what you said that filled me with happiness. One is that you reminded everyone that it is about the relationship between the donor and recipients. That's the point. That's why we started thinking about and talking about this approach at the Center for Global Development, because we're working on the way the donors could do better as much as anything else. So I like that about the relationship. And the second thing is because you use these words of innovation and the engine of innovation at the local level, which is sort of a better way to express that feature that we call hands-off. In fact, it's not necessary that donors be completely hands-off. What's necessary is that they only help when asked. So, and I think the point about the global externalities aren't there for local solutions in the case of AIDS is a really great one. Okay, on to David. Thank you very much, Kenneth.
Thanks,
from
Nancy.
me, if not from Mead.
Thanks, Nancy. Mead asked me to talk about how paying for outcomes could improve national ownership and performance. And let me begin by saying that I think Mead's book is very timely. I think we'd all agree the incentives in HIV are very misaligned. What's happened globally in many countries is we've solved the problem of AIDS deaths, and we've done it at no cost to countries. So we've removed the problem and removed any incentive to change the situation. And that's the reality. It confronts another reality, and that is the global economic crisis is 5 years old, but deficit reduction hasn't even begun yet. And so it's my working assumption that we're at the high water mark of international assistance for AIDS and for health. And so in that context, we have to look at what we can do differently and better. And I think that paying for outcomes could contribute in a number of ways. I think there are 4 major trends that will happen in global HIV financing, and we can link COD to them. First, I think middle-income countries will have to pay for their own AIDS programs almost immediately, and we are largely there. Countries such as South Africa and India are already paying for over 80% of their programs. But countries like South Africa and India can use paying for outcomes for more efficient use of their own assistance. South Africa gives block grants to its provinces. India's NACO gives money to its states. Paying for outcomes could help them to use their own resources more efficiently. I think the second thing which has to happen is most international assistance for HIV is going to have to focus on low-income, high-burden countries. About 20 to 30 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's where global HIV financing will need to focus. But in those countries, we have to achieve better outcomes, and I can see that paying for outcomes, incentivizing prevention, incentivizing countries to worry about the AIDS burden could play an important role. The third thing that I think we all recognize has to happen is we have to be more efficient. As Mead has said, it's difficult to go through 28% year-on-year growth in financing for a decade and to use that money optimally. There are probably greater inefficiencies in HIV than elsewhere. We know of one country in Africa, for example, where 20 to 40% of the whole HIV budget was spent on coordination before a tablet or a condom was purchased. And these are things that cash on delivery, that paying for outcomes can help us to wring out of the system. And then the final thing, which is the focus of so much of what Mead says, is that prevention simply has to work. There have to be incentives for prevention. We have to reward effective prevention. And I think, unlike Jimmy, we have to do it in the context of declining resources. So whatever happens, we have to allocate resources more efficiently, and we have to ensure that countries use mechanisms such as paying for outcomes that utilize the resources more efficiently. So I think it's a really bold book that contributes to a critical debate at exactly the right moment. Thanks, Mead.
So how generalizable that is, as Mike Cohen himself, the principal investigator for HPT 1052, pointed out in the discussion that Nancy moderated last week that you can see on the web, how generalizable that result is to scale up in the general population is something we don't yet know. That said, when one takes that number, that 96%, and one puts it into long-term projection models, either my model or those of many other people, you don't get an answer to the AIDS epidemic. You don't get to an AIDS transition with AIDS treatment alone. And even the one very famous paper, Ruben Granick's paper about South African, that purports to show that one might be able to eventually save money after the year 2030 by universal access. He has a magic trick that he does. He assumes that one of the big things that happens is that behavior changes. And I don't think that's true, and I think that we have to recognize that we don't have the money to do that. Whatever we have the money to do, that's what the AIDS transition's going to do.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm just seeing that
I can go
we've
on,
taken way more time than I should have allowed on the introductory remarks, although they were really excellent. Maybe I could go... Jimmy, do you want to take 1 minute on is HPN 052 a game changer?
There are plenty of people in the audience who know.
Okay, we'll go back to that. Okay. Okay, so second question, Mead. Lori made the point that it's difficult to measure incidence and it's difficult to measure infections avoided. Don't say too much because we don't want to take too much time. The question I have is, would you want those measured anyway, independent of cash on delivery aid or paying for performance? Is it important that we measure those anyway? Can I say, like Barney Frank does sometimes, yes or no? That's it.
Yes.
Okay. For later, we'll find out. We'll find out why.
It's tough when your boss is your moderator, right?
Follow it up. Do you agree with Lori that this is a problem, that at the moment we don't have a way, the community doesn't have a way to measure these things?
I do agree, and Jimmy made the same point in a way. He said he made it differently. So Laurie talked about the technology, and Jimmy talked about how it would be very expensive to measure prevalence.
Prevalence is easy to measure. I'm talking about incidence.
Well, he was talking about prevalence, but that's right. So you were talking about the technological difficulty measuring incidence. I think that we're on the verge of solving that problem, but people have been saying that about vaccines for a long time too. So I share your hesitancy to be sure of that. That's one of the approaches that we talk about in the book, as you know. But I really think the thing that's ready for prime time now is repeated prevalence measures, and they do cost millions of dollars. And by heaven, when you're talking about $500 billion of potential AIDS treatment expenditure, that a large chunk of which could be avoided by better tracking of new infections, I don't see why we shouldn't be spending millions on repeated, much more comprehensive, much larger prevalence measures, and use those measures to measure incidence.
Okay, I think with that, even though I haven't really had a good round with our fantastic panel, we'll just go and see what questions and comments you have, and give the panel a chance to wind up on anything at the end if they want. Please introduce yourself, please, when you ask a question.
I'm Mandy with Results Educational Fund, and my question, I guess, is for Mead about equity. I'm wondering if you reward countries that have improvements in outcomes, then are by default you punishing others, and are people who live in countries who are unable to achieve these results getting an unequal chance to get access to treatment, which is something that the HIV community cares a lot about, equal access.
Okay, we're going to collect several and then turn. Bill McGreevy? And if you have a question for a specific person up here, please say so. That's a good idea, actually.
Just asking, cash delivery for what? Cash on the what is delivered. It's not a package from UPS. Maybe what you want to talk about is whether a donor and a government could agree, in fact, have a whole discussion about what they might want to deliver on. And then, just as you're suggesting otherwise, maybe we could have an agreement with some governments and not others. That might be a way
Right,
to
so
think of it.
definitely the idea is an agreed goal, but you might want to clarify what exactly, again, in what you're talking about. Others?
Yeah.
In the back, far in the back.
Hi,
And then
my name
Nancy
is
on the-
Matthew Morton from the University of Oxford. Appreciate your presentation. And I'd like to get more, as Nancy started to get to, what do you mean by hands-off? And I was thinking about the presentation by Ken and how this could lead to further innovation, but I wonder if that might be a euphemism for reinventing the wheel, and if in fact we might go more adrift from evidence-based practice, which MRC models suggest. We might be able to evaluate and achieve impacts and assess impacts, but then follow a logical continuum where we adapt models to local contexts and better understand implementation science in that way, and wondering if this will move us further away rather than closer to it.
Okay, that's a good question. One more, Nancy?
I'm Nancy Padian from today from University of California, Berkeley, and I'm sort of on not sort of, I am in fact in Jimmy's camp, where I think that 052 was a game changer. But for me, the main reason why it was a game changer is it completely blurs the distinction between treatment and prevention. So, which means that it's a little bit harder to follow this. But getting back to what Ken said, I wonder if the room for innovation at the community level is actually having to do with adherence and retention on treatment. Because as Mead said, and he's right, Mike has said this as well, that is really high quality, well-monitored treatment. And if you follow our treatment cascades in terms of when someone gets tested to staying on treatment, they're abysmal. And to me, one of the crying needs, which really is highlighted by the fact that treatment is, we need to think of treatment as part of prevention, is innovative ways to really focus at a community level on adherence and retention in treatment or prevention.
Okay, maybe what we could do, okay, Maureen Lewis from the World Bank. Maybe then I'll see if anyone else has, and then I'll go back to the panel, and you won't have another chance after Maureen unless you put your hand up.
Desperate. Okay, thank you, Nancy. Thanks. I really like this panel. You came with lots of different perspectives. I just wanted to follow up on some of the comments that had been made, because I had some that are slightly differently. I think on this cash on delivery, if you can get it at different levels, you may be better off than doing it at a national level, because you can also have a situation where 20% within a country are doing really well and the other 80% are doing very poorly. And you need to have some way to parse that if you're going to be able to and give rewards where things are actually working well, which gives, I know you don't like the word incentives, but I actually find it a really useful thing to have. And it gives incentives to others who see this to do better. So I think that it's important to see it at a local level, at a state or province level, and as well as at the national level. And the second point I wanted to make is that treatment and prevention, unfortunately, they can be the same thing, but it's an extremely expensive way to do prevention. And we do have examples of countries that have done prevention extremely well at a much lower cost. And both Brazil and Thailand did that, as did Rwanda. So you have 3 countries that have been quite successful. And one of the things that they did, although they didn't monitor infections, they monitored prevalence continuously, and they could see the changes. In fact, I did a projections model in the early 90s that Mead was my commenter on, and did have criticisms, but was largely supportive. And the Brazilians still use this and say, see, our prevalence is way down. And the World Bank said we would never get there, which is not what we said, but it's okay. It was essentially an incentive for them to sort of say, guys, we did it, and you thought we couldn't do it. But they got a lot of money from us. And then when they did well, they got more money. So it wasn't quite cash on delivery, and they would have gotten it anyway, unfortunately. Or we could look at it that way. So, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Yes, one more. Oh, 2 more, 3 more. Okay, if you're quick, and then we'll go for last round.
My question is, sorry, I'm Juliana Kohler from Deloitte Consulting, and my question is related to many of the others that have come up, but I'm wondering how to deal with country ownership in countries like Ghana, where I used to work, where the government was mandating that, well, not mandating, but the government was prioritizing youth and general population prevention, and it was actually the U.S. government that was spending all of its money working with most at-risk populations, and it took, I think, around 10 years of U.S. government funding MARPS prevention before the Ghanaian government finally said, okay, yes, this is where we need to concentrate our funding.
Okay, great. That's a good question. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
My name is John Osik, and I am from Apt Associates. My question is regarding the cost and the feasibility of COD when you are dealing with governments whereby governance issues may be a challenge. I'm giving this question based on, for example, the experience of the Mo Ibrahim Prize, which was given to governments and presidents in case they do a good thing, then they get a prize. But it hasn't been taken up and hasn't brought the results we want. How do you think this is going to do better than the Mo Ibrahim Prize for incentives to governments?
Okay, one more. Thank you.
Beverly Armstrong from IRD, and mine is a practical question too. In other places I've worked with Pathfinder, with Pepfar funds, with just implementation, I know the on-the-ground reality of how the urge for more accountability of government funds and global funds and with all of the issues around that, the prospect that anyone is going to say, here's some money and we're going to be hands off. We had a very
okay, so no, come to your question, okay, because, sorry.
We had a lovely story.
Or it's okay, this is a good comment, that's enough.
In Tanzania, I think it was, that people were bonding together and only one in the group would go and get the antiretrovirals, and then they would encourage one another to take. And I was just thinking, oh hell, nobody would let him sign for 8 doses because that would be seen as graft and corruption in any of these programs.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. So Mead, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'm going to go through the panel and give each person a chance to comment on anything you heard. I'm going to ask Mead to try to lay off the many good questions about cash on delivery and instead refer everyone to the book, although you could say a little if you want. But a lot of the issues you've raised are addressed in the book that's on our website called Cash on Delivery Aid. About reputation, about hands-off, about national versus local, about equity, right. And I'm very encouraged to hear that there are these good questions about an approach that can apply across a number of areas, maybe more difficult to apply in the case of HIV than in some other areas. David, maybe you could address the point that Nancy raised about are they merging together, treatment and prevention, or is it is it sensible conceptually and practically to still maintain some sort of a difference in thinking about what to do next?
I think Nancy raised a really positive point, and that is that we have an added reason to do prevention better. It has a great treatment benefit. We have an added reason to do treatment better. It has a great treatment effect, and it also has an added prevention benefit. I also agree with other commentators, including Maureen, that in an optimal world it would be an expensive way to do prevention. And if we look at countries with concentrated epidemics, we actually have some low-cost solutions. India's managed to avert about 70% of its epidemic through low-cost interventions. I'm not convinced we have low-cost behavioral solutions in generalized epidemics. I think we are largely back to the things that we've talked about, treatment for prevention and male circumcision. And my closing remark is what I find poignant about Hillary Clinton's comments about a week ago is 10 years ago we went to the world and we said we need billions more and we don't know what works, and we got it in a different economic environment. Today we're going to the world and we say we know a lot more about what works, but we're saying it to an exhausted system. And I just think unless we can do things radically more efficiently and effectively, we're not getting more money.
Let me go next to Jimmy on that and ask you two questions. I forgot, like Rick Perry. And they were so good.
You can have a makeup.
Oh, I know what it is. So Kenneth said, what else do you suggest? He said in talking about the book, if you're a critic of the approach Mead is taking, could you, Jimmy, put yourself in a world where in fact resources are not increasing and might be declining? What else do you suggest?
Well, I'm clearly not the expert on the drug research part of this, but I think that the cost of treatment, there are some real options. There are new drugs under development that could be more effective, less toxic, cheaper, probably more effective, and that the assumption that we can't put more people on treatment, that it's the cost of treatment which is the fixed item, I think is one that we have to fight against, both and more effective ways of delivering that treatment. But I also think that we're in the United States. There are treatment waiting lists in some states in the US, but we have made a commitment to provide that treatment for everyone who needs it here. And I think to not do that in countries where AIDS is taking a huge cut in productivity and in affecting families and so on. I mean, for every these figures are from Pepfar, but for every 1,000 people on treatment, there are 449 orphans averted. Every 1,000 people put on treatment every year, 449 orphans averted. There's 60% of the treatment costs are covered just in the averted deaths and sickness there. And if you talk about the productivity gains of the people who are healthy and therefore able to work, the treatment costs, this is a Global Fund Harvard study, appear to be actually net positives. So I think the question of limited resources is what time frame are you talking about and how we can get the discussion to be talking about investments. I think you can't be naive and say that the U.S. budget is going to continue to go up. On the other hand, with national contributions, especially in some of the key countries going up, we need to leverage what we're doing in a more effective way. And I don't know, a couple of the comments I wanted to respond to quickly, but
yes,
you're...
and I did cut you off. You can
No,
take
that's
another
okay.
minute.
I was being mean.
You can have another
I was
minute.
being mean, and I won't be mean. The question about Thailand, for instance, which had an enormous drop, and I think that's a great example of performance-based incentives, but the rewards or penalties were to brothel owners. And when you had brothel-based sex workers and you imposed some rewards and punishments on the brothel owners, that worked very quickly to do that. I think that, we need to think creatively about what that tells us about other models with other populations. There are not a lot of brothel-based sex workers in high prevalence countries in Africa. But that's
okay, I'm going to interrupt you again,
Okay.
Jimmy, because Lori has to go, and we are way over our the expected time. And
Equal access to HIV, though, is a question of why we would want to use
I'll come back to you.
percentage of treatment need. The question of how to deal with good and poor performers is more complicated, and in that context, I wanted to question how, if we made a multi-year commitment as the U.S. or as the Global Fund or anyone else to meeting a prevention of treatment need in DRC, because the percentage of treatment need, that's what I meant to say. In DRC, that number could keep growing and it would be a result of poor performance, whereas in countries like Botswana and Rwanda, nearly everyone who needs treatment is on it. And so the way we would support those programs should be in improving quality of treatment and so on. And so I'm a little bit worried that a formula like that would ignore some of the real questions of what do you do with people whose governments aren't good performers but nonetheless are in great need, and that is chronic and multiplies over time rather than would be reduced by a kind of cash on delivery formula, I think.
Kenneth, what would you like to say? You made me so happy before.
there were. I just wanted to point out. Nancy made a comment about and David also pointed out this cycle where the prevention and the treatment helps the prevention and everything like that. There's absolutely nothing in what Mead has proposed that doesn't take advantage of that, right? I mean, he's leaving it up to the local countries to figure out what's the best way to achieve treatment, and to the extent that. To achieve prevention, and to the extent that treatment is the best way to do that, if it turns out to be the most cost-effective way, then that'll do it. I think the only game changers that we're going to discover in this, and I think we should be, the scientific community should be working overtime to find these game changers, is a cure or a vaccine. Those are the only game changers, and everything else is going to be a combination of these types of things. I think there's absolutely no way in which we should talk about, stopping to treat or retreating in those types of things. The point is, in order to achieve the age transition, which we are not going to achieve by 2015, I'm a little surprised to hear that. I guess it was a particular type of transition we're supposed to achieve by 2015. It's like around the corner. In order to achieve the age transition, we have to start dealing with prevention in the absence of discovering a vaccine. And that's, I think, what this is all about. The really quick comment I wanted to make about cash on delivery, I'm not afraid of the word incentives, Nancy, Maureen, but I'm just careful about using it in public settings. But the thing, the immediate instinct that people have is, let's find the person at the local level. So someone even mentioned community, right? Communities aren't in here at all. We're talking about national governments. There's no mention of like the U.S. government contracting with a community. We, in this room, cannot go out and find who is the individual who we think is most likely to come up with the innovation. We can't do that. That's not going to happen. This has to be left up to nations. And some nations will divide it up to the states, and some states will send it out to the districts, but some nations won't. And, more importantly, there will be horrendous failures. Programs will be tried that are failures that we could look at and say were failures, but I'm sure that Mead would agree with me that as soon as we got up from this bench and went and sat down in the audience, we would chastise everyone here has been part of massive failures. Directed from here. We have all failed and done incredibly stupid things. So the idea that we're not going to change things around because we're afraid that someone else might do something stupid, I mean, what is that, right? I mean, that's crazy. Of course there will be mistakes made and that kind of thing. That's not the point. No one is saying cash on delivery is going to find only the right answers without making failures, but we need some help. And I don't want to tell a country that that the community is the one that's going to be the answer. It could be different in different countries.
Thank you very much, Kenneth Mead. I've really taken all your time away, but people have said good things.
Well,
about
also
your
the audience
book,
has been very patient, given that the food is outside. So thank you very much, and thanks for these comments. And I do take to heart Nancy Padian's point about how incentivizing adherence is also important. I want to really stress the fact that I'm in this entire book. It's true that HPTN 052 had not yet been published, but it's also true that I was aware of these results. There's nothing in the book that excludes the fact that treatment could be the major way to prevent HIV infections. The whole point of both the AIDS transition approach and the cash on delivery approach is that we leave the solution to that problem up to the local individuals and let them solve it. I was interested by the comment from the fellow who's from Oxford at the back, who says that these kinds of hands-off approaches might take us backwards. And I guess that's one reason why we're going to continue to fund inputs. But the other thing is that, we haven't really done very well on HIV prevention. There's been a substantial decline in treatment, as you can see from the graphs from UNAIDS. For the treatment, you can actually see since 2003 a deflection in the number of deaths, which must be due to Pepfar mainly, but also to other donors. You don't see that deflection in the new infections numbers. Africa is right like that, all the way from 1997 with no downward inflection. So we haven't got the answer. And I really agree very much with Ken's remarks on this, obviously. This answer needs to be worked out locally. If we have clarity in measurement, then those mistakes will get corrected.
So Thank you to all of you, and could we give a hand to Mead and the panelists?